Okay, so we just talked about for of and how it works with any iterable object in JavaScript. And that might make it seem like we can use it to iterate over an actual object, an object literal. But unfortunately, objects, actual object literals with curly braces, like this one right here, right, key value pairs, they are not considered iterables. Yes, they are objects, but they are not iterable objects. An array behind the scenes is technically an object. A string actually is an object too. Lots of other things like maps and sets, which we have not yet covered, those are considered objects behind the scenes. So long story short, the term object is a bit of a confusing one in JavaScript. But when we're talking about an actual object literal with our curly braces key value pairs, if we want to iterate over them, this is not going to cut it. For let's just go with person of test scores. You'll see what I get here, console.log person. This is exactly what we just saw in the last video. I've got this test scores object. I just have students' names and then their score on the test. If I refresh and I look at my code, uncaught error, test scores is not iterable. So we do have an option to iterate over an object. There is a loop that's been around for a very long time in JavaScript, which is the for in loop. It's kind of confusing, right? To have for of and then also for in. Just know that for of is used all the time. For in is pretty uncommon these days. But for in is going to iterate over an object. Now, what does it iterate over? There's two pieces of information. It's just going to give us the key. So if I take a look at this now and I refresh, we get Keenan, Damon, Kim all the way down. So it's just giving us the key in the object. If I want the value, well, I already have the key. I can get the value out. So I can do something like this. Let's do a string template literal. And let's have the person's name. So we'll do person, scored, and then the value, which would be test scores, right? Square brackets, person. Okay? Let's see what happens now. Refresh. Keenan scored 80, Damon scored 67, all that, all the way down. So key and then value. So that's one option. Another option, if you did need to iterate over an object, is to use special methods that we have not yet seen. These are new. There's a method capital O object dot keys, and then you pass in an object like test scores. And this gives us an array, an actual array made up of the keys from the object test scores. And there's also a values. So we get the values out of that object. And there's also one called entries. And this gives us a nested array of key value pairs. So these all are object, capital O object dot keys, values, and entries. So they just give us an array. So if I needed to iterate over the keys, for example, I could just turn it into an array. Well, I'm not turning it into an array, but make an array from those keys and then use a for of, because that does work over arrays. Now, if I just needed the keys, I could also just do what we saw here. But let's say I was interested in the values and I wanted to sum up all of these values, so all of the scores, and average them maybe. Well, I could do this, for let score of, and then I can do object dot values test scores. I can do that once again because this will give me an array, as we saw here. Object dot values, you give it an object inside, it returns to you an array of that object's values. So now I can iterate over that with a for of. Let's just do console.log score first. Refresh. And there we go. We're getting all of our scores. Now, let's sum them up. So I'm going to make a variable here. Let total equal 0. And then we'll add to total. Total plus equals score inside of our loop. So each time through, we'll add 80 and then 67 all the way down to 60. Let's see what we end up with for total. 797. So to average, now I just want to take the length of my object.values test scores. I just want to know how many items are in this object. Now, unfortunately, objects actually don't have a length. So if I do test scores.length, it's not going to work for me. It's not an array or a string or something with a length. So what I'll do though, if I have this array that has all the values, right? Every value is in this array. I could just take the length of that. So if I wanted to, I could just do let scores equal that. for let score of scores. Then at the very end, I can console.log the average, which is our total, divided by scores.length. Scores is the array of scores, right? It looks like this, where it's just whatever the scores are. I already forgot the order, but whatever that is. And then we're just taking our total that we summed up thanks to our loop, and then dividing by the total length of that array called scores. And the average is 79.7. All right, so that's kind of all I wanted to show you. Iterating over objects is not as common, nowhere near as common as iterating over arrays, but we do have a couple of options. We can use a for in, and that will give us the key, but we can use each key to access the value. Or I can use special object methods, capital O object, .values, .keys, .entries, to create new arrays that are based upon the keys or the values from some object that we pass in. And then I can use a regular old for of with that because I'm working with an array.